How successful a president was Barack Obama? Jonathan Chait will be here to talk about his new book, Audacity.
And I want to say, no, he actually did a lot. He didn't do everything he wanted to do, but if you compare him by any plausible baseline, he's been tremendously influential.
What effect did Darwin's On the Origin of Species have on America upon publication? Randall Fuller will be here to talk about the book that changed America.
God had created every species in the world separately and immutably. What Darwin did is he completely unraveled that idea by saying that all species have common ancestors.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world, and we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Jonathan Chait joins us now. He is a political columnist for New York Magazine, previously a senior editor at The New Republic, and the author of a new book called Audacity: How Barack Obama Defied His Critics and Created a Legacy That Will Prevail. Jonathan, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And this is not, you make it very clear, this is not a history of the Obama administration. It's not a biography of Obama. What did you set out to do in this book?
I had an analysis and an argument about Obama and what I thought he had done and what I thought people were getting wrong about him from the beginning and throughout his presidency. And I wanted to put this argument together. This is the argument that I think historians, or at least the best historians, are going to arrive at. I wanted to correct what I think a lot of people have failed to see about what Obama has managed to do in this country.
And what is the argument you want to make in the book?
I think he's been tremendously successful. Not completely successful. This isn't an authorized account, and I try to acknowledge places where he fell short in the book. So it's not coming from Obama. But I think overall he's been a tremendously successful and influential president, much more than I think his supporters realize. If you ask the average Democrat about Obama, usually you get an answer like, he didn't get that much done, but it's the Republicans' fault. They like him, but mostly they feel sadness at what he wasn't able to do. And I want to say, no, he actually did a lot. He didn't do everything he wanted to do, but if you compare him by any plausible baseline, he's been tremendously influential.
I want to get into that criticism from the left a little bit. Do you think that that criticism from the left is in response to either A, the right's criticism of Obama, and so they're sort of taking a preemptive defensive position against that, or does it stem from the farther to the left criticism of Obama? Because that's kind of like a mainstream liberal critique of Obama's tenure.
That's a great question, and I devote a lot of attention to that question in the book, because that, I think, is one of the most important sources of people getting this presidency wrong. One of the things I try to show in this book is that liberals are always upset with Democratic presidents every single time. Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, every single one of them, liberals were upset, and every single one of them, they said the exact same things. They said, he's feckless, he's not addressing the problem, he's not speaking out for our values, he's a compromiser. Exact same critique every time.
And that they succumb to the other side, that they fall victim to trying to appease the other side or compromise. Or
he's giving away the story, he's not speaking out for our values, we need a true liberal.
I mean, contrast that just for a second with the right's response, which seems to be always to defend their guy.
There is a real difference. And I think if you actually look at the psychological differences between conservatives and liberals, a lot of social psychologists, political psychologists have studied it. Conservatives are more comfortable supporting a leader and being part of a team and defending against outside threats. And liberals have more of a psychological makeup of questioning their leader and wanting to see themselves as outsiders. So I think liberals are more uncomfortable defending power. And conservatives are more comfortable in that role.
This is the Jonathan Haidt kind of analysis of the political right mindset versus the left.
That's right. And lots of other social psychologists have arrived. It's pretty much a consensus within the political psychology field that those are the kind of differences between right and left.
But has something changed, with Clinton and with Obama in that, the Clinton, there was such a sense of frustration and sort of lost opportunity on the left because of all of the scandals and everything that they felt got in the way. Do you think that is carried over into Obama, or is it something different?
I think the response to every Democratic president is pretty much the same.
Really? This is nothing new
You're
at
giving
all.
up whatever you've done. It's not enough. You haven't gone far enough. You've compromised too much. Now, it's not always true or untrue to the same extent. With Jimmy Carter, it was completely true. Mm-hmm. He was a mostly failed president who blew huge opportunities and did nothing.
Although there's now there's the rehabilitation of Jimmy Carter thing going on.
Well, that's exactly right. They all get rehabilitated in retrospect. And during Obama's presidency, you had this huge boom that people have forgotten about, in which Bill Clinton was the model. If only Obama would fight like Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton. Those were real liberals who knew how to beat the Republicans. And he doesn't have they often use testicular metaphors for both of them for this quality that Obama apparently lacked that Clinton had. But always after they're gone, they become rehabilitated.
I like that phrase, testicular metaphors. Is that your phrase?
Actually, I was trying to make it sound less gross, but I think I actually made it worse.
Yeah, I think you did. We'll keep it. I mean, in one sense, you can't say that Obama didn't accomplish anything looking at today's moment, because the Trump administration is coming in and the first thing they want to do is sort of dismantle what Obama did. So
they want to dismantle a lot of his accomplishments, and I make the case in this book that it's going to be much harder than people think. Some of them just can't be dismantled, like the measures to stop the economic emergency in 2009. Mm-hmm. They're not going to bring back the 2008 financial crisis. That's literally impossible without time travel, right? You can't do that.
But do you think that Obama, throughout his second administration in particular, banked on an incoming Democratic president? And did that affect sort of the way in which he got things done, thinking like this is going to be continued?
He definitely was planning in some ways for it to be continued. I don't think he would have done anything different if he knew that there'd be a Republican that followed him. Different parts of his legacy are more vulnerable than others. Climate, as I write in the book, is more vulnerable. He started an enormous green energy revolution, and the world is a completely different place in terms of climate policy, in diplomacy, in technology, in the cost of these new technologies than it was when he started. It's a total transformation, but that needs to accelerate.
Yes.
And he was hoping that Hillary Clinton would just continue to deepen the decarbonization that he began. And Trump obviously is not going to do that. At the same time, Trump is not going to be able to reverse it. He's not even going to be able to stop it, because coal is just getting priced out of the market everywhere, and solar energy is getting cheaper, wind power is getting cheaper. All these technologies are getting cheaper, and that's not going to stop.
What did Obama do? What could he have done, and what did he do in the period between this past election and Inauguration Day for Trump to preserve his legacy? I mean, were there measures that he took or that he could have taken, and did he, to kind of cement in what he had accomplished?
I don't think he's done anything terribly different than he would have done if Hillary Clinton would have won. I don't think you're going to make regulations, executive actions that you wouldn't have otherwise taken, and a lot of those things can be overturned. But I think it's a myth that Obama only did executive actions, that he only used his pen to go around Congress. This is a myth that Republicans have found convenient as a way of delegitimizing his authority and his actions. It's a story they've told themselves, and I think many of them believe that they will be able to wipe out his legacy very quickly because he just used a pen to sign some executive actions. But if you read the book, that's not the case.
Has the criticism from the left or from the right been more effective in terms of underestimating what Obama has accomplished?
So if you look at the rhetoric that came from the right, it's changed dramatically. The first thing they said when he took office and outlined his goals, they said, he's going to completely transform America. He's going to turn us into a socialist hellhole. We will never be the same place again. This is the most sweeping agenda anyone's ever proposed. As I show in the book, he did everything he said he was going to do in those initial speeches. But then their line changed. Then it became he hasn't really done very much at all. And the reason, of course, is they said that there would be weeds growing in the streets of the major cities, and we would be the Soviet Union if those things came to pass, and they didn't. So they needed a new explanation. It completely flipped from this agenda is sweeping to this agenda is nothing. The left criticism has been more consistent.
When you were writing this book, did you write it more for those critics on the left? When you think about who you're trying to persuade with this argument, with this sort of correction of or early rehabilitation of the historical of Obama and his historical record, were you thinking about persuading people on the left?
I'm trying to persuade everybody.
Yeah.
I spend time with the critics on both sides, probably more on the right because they had more power in Congress. So I address more of the criticism toward them. And I think I try to show how they pulled the center with them in ways that don't make the center look good in retrospect. If you look at what people who were the Washington establishment and trying to be bipartisan were saying throughout Obama's presidency, and I have a lot of it in the book, it just doesn't hold up very well. They were being influenced by these these bad faith arguments that were coming from the right. And they gave the conservatives and the Republicans, I think, credit that they didn't deserve. And Trump is a big part of this book. And I think Trump shows how bad faith so much of the Republican response was, that it was purported to be about the Constitution and deficit spending and limited government and these abstract principles. And I think Trump's nomination and the ease with which the party fell in line behind him shows how that was not really the animating cause.
I want to talk a little bit about the pragmatics of addressing Trump in a book like this. You're used to working on a weekly magazine or biweekly magazine,
right.
New York, as well as on a 24/7, cycle for New York's website. But obviously, publishing a book doesn't quite work that way.
Right.
Did you, after the election, go back and revise what you had written, or did you all along know that you were going to kind of hold it and then add whatever happened with the election to the end of the book?
I finished the main draft at the end of 2015, but I kept adding and kept revising as new things were changing. The original plan was to do a brief postscript after the election. And then when Trump won, everyone began saying Trump is going to erase Obama's legacy. So I realized that I had to do a lot of changes. I couldn't just add a paragraph. I changed the subhead. I added 5,000 words of material within the week after the election.
Wow.
Going through every single chapter saying, okay, what is Trump going to do? What does Trump's election mean to this subject that I just addressed in this chapter? Some of them, it meant a lot. Some of them, it meant very little. But every single place had to account for that change.
That's not easy.
It wasn't easy. My editor, Jeff Chandler, was amazing. He came down in my house and stayed with me. And when we worked till 1 a.m. on a Sunday, just cranking it out.
Wow. I have to ask one final question, which is not going to be addressed in the book, but given that Barack Obama just gave his farewell address, what were your impressions of his address, and how effective do you think a job did he do in terms of communicating what he has accomplished and what he intends to do when he's out of office?
It was striking to me how little of Obama's farewell address concerned his own accomplishments. He went through them very perfunctorily. And almost the entire thing was about Trump, which is pretty unusual.
Without mentioning him?
Without mentioning Trump's name. It was an analysis of Trumpian politics and a warning for America for how it had to fight them and how it had to overcome them, which is pretty unusual for a farewell address.
What did you think of it?
I liked it. I liked most of what Obama does. We're ideologically simpatico in a lot of ways, which is one of the things that made me want to do this project all along. I think he has a pretty sharp analysis of the causes of Trumpism, and it was a pretty stark warning for what America has to do to defend its way of government.
It's also a stark contrast with the first news conference that President-elect Trump gave.
Everything Trump does is a stark contrast with Obama. He's just his opposite in almost every single way, temperamentally, intellectually, ideologically, stylistically. There were worryingly authoritarian signs in that press conference, and there have been those kinds of signs throughout his campaign.
As a political columnist specifically, what was it that Trump said that most concerned you? The
premise of his entire press conference was that every question about anything he had done had been settled once and for all by the election. That essentially politics was not an ongoing process that was going to continue throughout his administration, but a one-time event settled at the polls. And so tax returns, well, I won. Question solved. Russia ties, I won. Only you liberal media, which is completely illegitimate, cares about this. You're crooked, you're fake news. It's over. That's how autocrats in semi or barely democratic countries function. You have some kind of election and then politics is over.
It's so interesting because yet another contrast with what Obama did during his farewell address, which was less of a recap and more of a look forward.
That's right. Obama took much more interest in the shape and health of politics going forward than Trump did.
All right. More to come from you on Trump, I imagine. But for now, Obama. Jonathan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
The book, again, is Audacity, How Barack Obama Defied His Critics and Created a Legacy That Will Prevail by Jonathan Chait.
This is John Williams, and Alexandra Alter joins me now with news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, John.
So today is the day that we get a new president.
That's right. And an avalanche of books about him.
Yeah, so how has he already changed the publishing landscape?
Well, immediately after the election, I think everyone was kind of stunned. A few people had to sort of shift gears and change plans for books that they had already contracted. But very quickly, for the publishing industry, which often moves at a glacial pace, people rallied and put out these kind of instant Trump books. There's a bunch of them coming out in time for the inauguration or shortly after. The biggest crop that I'm looking at right now kind of can be broken into two categories. There's the sort of how he did it kind of book and how unprecedented it was that he kind of pulled off this major upset that we hadn't seen the likes of in decades of American politics.
Right.
And there are a few of those coming out. And then the other major category is how to survive the Trump era. So you can imagine sort of the politics of the publishers that are putting the books out. They do vary. A couple of examples include a book coming out from Regnery, which is a conservative publisher, called How Trump Won, The Inside Story of a Revolution, which is written by Joe Pollack and Larry Schweikart. And Joel Pollack is an editor at large, I believe, at Breitbart. Both of them are pretty well-known conservative writers. Another book that's coming out, not from a conservative publisher, but certainly from a conservative angle, is The Making of the President 2016, which is coming out on January 31st and is written by Roger Stone, who is, of course, a political consultant who was deeply involved in the Trump campaign for a while. And that is being published by Sky Horse. And it's supposedly going to be written in the spirit of Theodore White's The Making of the President 1960. So,
well, the Theodore White books, though, were very granular, deeply reported books about the campaign trails. And this, I can't imagine that any of these quickie books are really going to be able to tell us the full story of what happened.
Reconstruct it in that amount of detail. Yeah, often, when you want those really juicy sort of stories, or something like Game Change, which was the model for a while of how to do a post-election post-mortem book, you want some distance from it so that people will open up. Or you have somebody with with an inside sort of scoop. And who knows what Roger Stone will actually reveal that wasn't covered in the endlessly covered months leading up to the election.
I feel like you need someone who is like deeply embedded with the campaigns as a journalist, and it seems like that's happening less and less these days.
Yes, I think because there was so much moment-to-moment coverage, everyone was exhausted and nobody wanted to write that kind of book. Another Trump book that is coming out in the spring, although this one is not being crashed, it's actually being delayed, is Ivanka Trump's book, Women Who Work. It's being pushed back from early March to early May, and that's being published by Portfolio. And they said that the reason for the delay is momentous changes, unspecified momentous changes in Ivanka's life that have made it hard for her to finish
there
up
will
work
at least
in
be
the
a
book.
new preface just acknowledging that now her dad is president.
Perhaps, yes. And then on the Trump survival side of things, coming mostly from the liberal side, from publishers, we have the Trump Survival Guide, which came out already on January 10th. That was put together very quickly by Gene Stone, and the subtitle is Everything You Need to Know About Living Through What You Hoped Would Never Happen. Nothing subtle about that subtitle. And the New Press has several books coming out this spring. One is titled Rules for Resistance, Advice from Around the World in the Age of Trump, which will have an introduction by David Cole, who's the National Legal Director of the ACLU, and will have contributions by Ai Weiwei, George Soros, Ariel Dorfman, and others. This was an interesting addition, I thought, to their spring publishing list. This book is titled How Do I Explain This to My Kids? Parenting in the Age of Trump, which is edited by Dr. Ava Siegler and includes pieces by a range of writers, including Topher Sanders, Carlos Sandoval, Mira Jacob, and others. So these are parents who are sort of trying to be good role models and talk to their children about Trump.
I had a book cross my desk the other day from Melville House called What We Do Now, and it's an anthology, and it has something very, very brief from Bernie Sanders, and I think a recreated speech by Elizabeth Warren and a piece by Dave Eggers.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that one up. That's been a big one. They've been really promoting it. And I think, when you do have to throw these things together quickly, getting an anthology is probably the fastest and easiest route to getting not only a range of perspectives, but well-crafted pieces that, each person can kind of pull off an essay. But, putting out a 200 or 300-page book in a couple months can be challenging.
But it will be interesting to talk a year from now and see maybe what some of the longer-term things and the more deeply reported things are that come out of this campaign.
Yes, I think that will be down the road for sure. Another thing that's happening in the literary world, of course, is there are writers protesting in various ways. One of the biggest protests was organized by PEN America. It was held in New York, and 2,000 artists and writers showed up on January 15th at the New York Public Library.
They showed up outside the library.
That's right. They
didn't all cram in there.
No, they didn't cram in there. And some of the writers in attendance were Rita Dove, the poet, the U.S. Poet Laureate, Robert Pinsky, the comic artist Art Spiegelman, the young adult author Jacqueline Woodson. So there were some big names there, and there were 90 other gatherings around the country as well. So,
well, I imagine we'll be hearing from a lot of writers this weekend as the
absolutely,
I'm
sure that'll
begins.
happen too.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Randall Fuller joins us now from Tulsa, Oklahoma. His latest book is called The Book That Changed America: How Darwin's Theory of Evolution Ignited a Nation. Randall, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
This is not your first book that's kind of looked at the role of literature or a specific book or author in American history. You've written From Battlefields Rising, How the Civil War Transformed American Literature, as well as Emerson's Ghosts, Literature, Politics, and the Making of Americanists. How did you come to this particular subject?
I began with an interest in Darwin. I think like many students of American culture, I had been taught in graduate school that Darwin really didn't become a factor in American culture until after the Civil War. And one day I was reading a biography of Henry David Thoreau and stumbled upon a little nugget that Thoreau had read on the origin of species almost as soon as it reached American shores. And that got me interested in tracing Darwin's, arrival on American shores. I knew the book had come out in 1859, but I was rather surprised to learn that it had such an immediate impact upon the intellectual culture of America before the Civil War.
Now, just to give us a little bit of context here, so it was published in the UK in 1859. I'm assuming then it didn't have a different American edition in the same year. How does that work at that time? Did UK books just sort of come over here, or were they published separately by American publishers?
There was no copyright law in America at that time, so books published in England were actually pirated fairly quickly in the United States. The story about Darwin's book is that as soon as it was published in November of 1859, he sent several copies to scientist friends of his in America, the most prominent being Asa Gray, who was a botanist at Harvard. And Gray immediately began to negotiate with American publishers for the right to reprint on the origin of species. The reason he did that is because sometimes a publisher would give a kind of courtesy fee as they pirated the text. So Gray was able to negotiate a couple $100 for Darwin with a New York publisher, and the American edition actually came out on January 10th, 1860, so just about 2 months after it was published in England.
Was it altered in any way in its American edition?
It wasn't. The first edition was not altered, but Darwin continued to tinker with the text, and there were 6 or so editions that he altered. The preface, epigrams, things like that were added and taken away over the course of a couple of years.
As you mentioned earlier, most Americans think of Darwin's impact here, if they do at all, as subsequent to the Civil War, but I would say even more so with the Scopes trial in 1925. But give us a sense of what happened between 1859 and the Scopes trial in 1925 in terms of how On the Origin of Species was received here and the impact it had.
Sure. As you can imagine, with such an audacious and revolutionary idea, there was almost immediately a split opinion over Darwin's book. For those people who have read Origin of Species, it's hard not to be impressed by the enormous amount of data and examples and just factual information that Darwin provides. And so almost from the outset, American scientists were impressed and largely convinced by Darwin's book. As we know, that book encountered more difficulty with the religious community, and especially the religious press of the 1860s and 1870s, worried and fretted over the possibility that Darwinian natural selection eliminated God from the equation, took providence out of the creation of species and especially of humans. By about 1880, Darwinian science is largely accepted certainly by the academic classes, but I would say by most reading and literate Americans. And really, the Scopes trial is kind of a last gasp of the 19th century religious community arguing that the book is wrong-headed, is anti-religious. The story of Darwinian theory, in some ways, is a story of widespread acceptance that is resisted increasingly as time goes by.
I think for many people who haven't read the book, it's easy to get a little bit confused about what exactly is in it, because we tend to think of it as including sort of not only the precise scientific discussion that's in that book, but sort of everything else that Darwin either said subsequent or was attributed to him, or ways in which he was interpreted. So what exactly was in the book?
Darwin's big contribution to science isn't so much the theory of evolution. There had been a number of scientists and philosophers before him, and for 80 or so years before him, who were speculating that species had evolved from prior species. What Darwin's great contribution was a purely mechanical explanation for how species change might occur, and he called that natural selection. Mm-hmm. One of his great examples is you have a litter of wolves that is born during a year where rabbits, which the wolves typically hunt, are down for one reason or the other, and hares, which are a faster prey and also better camouflage, are up in their population. What Darwin argues is that it makes sense that in that litter of wolf pups, those who can see better and those who are faster will thrive and survive better than those pups who can't. And that over time, and for him time is hundreds of millions of years, those animals that are best adapted, those wolves that are best adapted, might break away and become either a variation or a different species entirely. Darwin's Origin of Species says nothing about humans. Mm-hmm. He's very careful to keep humans out of this discussion. He knew that was an explosive topic. And so his discussion focuses entirely upon plants and animals. Having said that, and the reason the work was so explosive from the outset is readers immediately translated natural selection to society. Within months, there is a debate in England about the primate ancestry of humans, and in the United States, the great debate having to do with Darwin is over African Americans and slavery.
I was just about to ask how the response in America differed from the response in England, which you've started to answer. The subtitle of your book is that it ignited a nation. In what way did it do that in America?
In the United States, in late 1859 and through the year 1860, the North and the South were poised in extremely heightened and intense antagonism toward one another. The language of newspapers at that time is full of, whether North or South, saying we are a separate people from that other region. and we are fighting for our survival against that other region. So there was a way in which Darwin's idea of competition in nature fit into a cultural configuration that was already here in the United States. But the division, of course, was over the question of slavery. From about the 1840s on, a group of American scientists known as the American ethnologists had made an argument that God had created every species in the world separately and immutably. So if he creates a monarch butterfly, that monarch butterfly will never change from now till 100 million years in the future. Similarly, the argument went by these scientists, God had created each race of humans separately. Africans had been created in Africa with dark skin. Caucasians had been created initially around the Caucasus Mountains. That was the incorrect idea. And they had white skin. God had created these different races with completely different abilities, mental aptitudes, and capacities for development. This was, of course, a great excuse or rationalization for the practice of slavery, because suddenly it seemed as though American science was saying black people were created inferior and stronger and better able to do the kind of work that we just happen to have them doing in the South right now.
Mm-hmm.
What Darwin did, and why his idea was so important in the United States in 1859 and 1860, is he completely unraveled that idea. He completely rebutted it by saying, in fact, that all species have common ancestors. And in doing so, the argument was almost immediately, Darwin was immediately adopted by some of the most prominent abolitionist intellectuals in the country as providing scientific proof that, in fact, black people and white people were brothers and sisters, were closely related, and that there was no separation and no rationalization for keeping them segregated from white people.
I want to end with the way you begin your book, which is with a dinner party on New Year's Day, 1860, because it was obviously a remarkable event. Tell us who was there, what was discussed, and why you chose to begin the book that way.
It came from my initial reading of just a one sentence in a biography of Henry David Thoreau that said he had encountered Darwin's book on New Year's Day, 1860, in Concord, Massachusetts. As a result, I tried to trace that book. I went to Concord. I tried to find out whose book that was, where it had come from. I discovered this really remarkable story, which is Charles Darwin, in November of 1859, sent one of the first copies of Origin of Species to his good friend and advocate, the Harvard botanist Asa Gray. Gray devoured that book within a week. He marked it up with pencil. He comments. He's excited. There's many, many exclamation points in the margins of that book. And over Christmas, one of his relatives, the social reformer Charles Loring Brace, visited him, and Gray passed the book on to him. It so happens that Brace was invited to give a talk on New Year's Day in Concord, Massachusetts, and he read Darwin's book on the train going to Concord, and that night at a dinner party, he introduced it to the guests. And those guests were, as you know already, Henry David Thoreau, but the abolitionist and firebrand advocate of John Brown, Franklin Sanborn, and finally the transcendentalist philosopher Bronson Alcott, who was also the father of Louisa May Alcott. Two of those people wrote accounts of that evening and described the discussion that they had, which was both about slavery and abolition and about Darwin's new book and its theories. After discussing that book, Henry David Thoreau then went on to get one of the first copies in Concord, Massachusetts, and began an incredible but unfinished project to try to prove Darwin's theory correct.
There's so much in there, including what those two accounts said, but I will leave the full details to, I hope, your future readers. Randall, thank you so much.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you.
The book again is The Book That Changed America, How Darwin's Theory of Evolution Ignited a Nation by Randall Fuller.
This is John Williams, again, joined by my colleagues Greg Coles and Jennifer Schuessler to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hey, Greg. Hey, Jenny.
Hi. Hi, Pamela. Oh, sorry, Force of Habit. Hi, John.
What are other people reading this week, Greg? What's on the list?
All the new books on the list are really not newcomers to the list. Karen White returns with one of her, I think it's her 22nd novel. She writes these North Carolina kind of women's novels. This is called The Guests on South Battery, new at number 10. Chris Bajalian is back on the list with a new novel called The Sleepwalker. That's new at number 12. Brad Taylor has the 900th book in his Pike Logan thriller series. It's called Ring of Fire, new at number 13. And then over in nonfiction, I guess the one kind of surprise bestseller is a macroeconomist named David M. Smick. He runs an economic consulting firm. He's got a book called The Great Equalizer, kind of looking at economic policy and how the government should be shifting an emphasis away from big corporations and toward entrepreneurs and small companies. There's also the Fox News host Brett Baer has a book called 3 Days in January. His last bestseller was kind of more personal. It was about his son, his young son, and a heart condition. It's called Special Heart. This book, 3 Days in January, is about the presidential transition between Dwight Eisenhower and JFK and how Eisenhower kind of warned JFK about national security issues, kind of handed off the Bay of Pigs. It's a timely look at presidential transitions.
Well, speaking of presidents, I think, Jenny, you are reading some presidential-themed books.
Yes. Can't imagine why, but I am in fact feeling a little bit president-y. And I just finished reading George Saunders' forthcoming novel, his first novel called Lincoln and the Bardo. And I won't step on my colleagues and betters who will be offering an informed critical assessment of it.
But you liked it.
It's a totally fascinating book that's based on a real historical episode. So Lincoln, I believe this was actually reported in newspapers at the time after the death of his very young son, Willie Lincoln. This is when, they were living in the White House. He was, totally bereft, and it was reported in a newspaper that he had gone to a cemetery to kind of mourn and commune with the body in the middle of the night. And so Saunders kind of takes off from there and kind of imagines this kind of the cemetery as this sort of drawing on Tibetan Buddhism, this sort of the bardo, this place between life and death, and just kind of assembles this totally fascinating cast of characters and draws on all sorts of historical sources, which he quotes in sort of essentially footnotes, and some of them are real and some of them are imagined. So we're kind of in the fake news period, so maybe this is perfect. But anyway.
So a lot of ghosts talking in this book.
A lot of ghosts talking, totally fascinating. And
it's kind of a collage, right? Or like an oral history.
Yeah, and deeply weird. And I'm really curious to read what others will make of it. And then I've also been reading this really interesting book, a work of history, biography called Never Caught. And it's by a historian named Erica Armstrong Dunbar. And she has researched the life of Ona Judge, who was an enslaved woman owned by George Washington, or George and Martha Washington, who ran away. The Washingtons, as they did with their runaway slaves, made great efforts to track her down, did not succeed. So this book tells her story. The story of her running away is known and is actually included in an exhibition at Mount Vernon about the Washingtons and slavery that opened up recently. The author has also sort of reconstructed Ona Judge's life as a free woman in New England, and which is a story that really wasn't fully known. So it's really fascinating. And as far as I can tell, all of her footnotes, unlike George Saunders, are real.
Greg, what are you reading these days?
Well, I know that you and Pamela tried to intimidate me with your big books. Pamela, of course, read Les Mis and then Hamilton.
I thought you were going to say Marie Kondo.
No, she was on that Hamilton kick for like 3 months. And then last week you told us that you had just started Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. So my next big project is a book that I think both of you have raved about in the past is Robert Caro's The Power Broker. And I intended to start reading that this week, and I could not find a copy of it. So I put an order in with my local indie bookstore, Barrett's Books, Darien, Connecticut.
Good citizen.
I think it's ready for me to pick up there now, but I have not done that yet. And so in the meantime, I'm tiding myself over with a much smaller and less intimidating book. It's a novel that came out a couple years ago called Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. It is a pretty grabby book, just plot-wise. It opens with the death of a teenage girl in this Chinese-American family in Ohio. It then backs up to kind of recreate the events leading up to her death. And in the telling also gets very much into issues of what it is to be the model minority or to feel other issues of being Asian American and in the Midwest. And so it's a book that really accomplishes a lot. It has a story that just moves right along. It's very well written, but it's also looking at a deeper subtext at the same time.
Well, when you said that the Caro is ready to pick up at your local books, I mean, you're really picking something up when you pick up The Power Broker because it probably weighs about 14 pounds. So just work out a little bit before you go to the store.
How about you, John? What are you reading?
I am still reading The Magic Mountain, which I'm greatly enjoying, but that's going to probably be a multi-week project. So I'm going to check in again about that when I'm done with it. And in the meantime, I'm going to try to read a bunch of little things on the side because I don't like getting bogged down in just one thing. So this week I read Miss Lonely Hearts, which is Nathaniel West's very brief. It's about 60 pages, although not 60 incredibly fast pages, about a columnist, an advice columnist, a man who goes by the name Miss Lonely Hearts.
Right.
And in the 1930s. It's sort of Don Draper by way of Dostoevsky.
Right. He's kind of this nihilist, right?
He wants to be, a drinker and a womanizer, but he's very... well, first of all, he's just haunted by these letters because he gets these incredibly desperate letters from people that actually do make him sympathize with them and feel desperate for them. And he doesn't know how to respond or how to help these people. And he's also very haunted by religion and tries to be Christ-like. But the whole thing is very dark and incredibly well written. But for such a short piece, it really packs in a lot of searching and despair.
Is that edition of Miss Lonely Hearts packaged with Day of the Locust?
It is. Yeah, it is, and it's a beautiful little
great
book.
Hollywood kind of novella.
Yeah, and I might get that's a little longer, and I may or may not read that next. But thanks for joining me, guys.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.